I am Julian, 29 years old. Exactly 6 months ago, my own flesh and blood tried to absolutely humiliate me in front of the most powerful and influential people in Charleston, all to elevate my older brother to a position of unearned glory. While I was standing there in a cheap, off-the-rack suit, desperately trying to fade into the background and simply survive the evening, my parents decided to use my existence as a convenient punchline. My brother literally dragged me across the pristine marble floor of an oceanfront estate worth tens of millions of dollars, stopped dead in front of his billionaire future father-in-law, and laughed while pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. He said, "This is the quiet one." My mother did not miss a single beat. She stepped right up beside him, adjusted her ridiculously expensive pearl necklace, and told a man she was utterly desperate to impress, "We don't really brag about him." They laughed together. They mocked me in front of over 200 high society guests. But there was one massive, world-shattering detail they did not know. The billionaire they were practically bowing down to, the man whose immense wealth and influence they were trying to attach their entire family legacy to, owed his flagship company's very survival to a highly classified, forensic financial report I wrote entirely in secret. And right now, as my family scrambles in sheer panic to save their crumbling reputations and their rapidly draining bank accounts, they are the ones begging me for a single moment of my time. Before I tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled my golden child brother's perfect, manufactured life without raising my voice a single time, please hit the like button if you believe that true, poetic justice always finds a way to balance the scales. And do not forget to let me know exactly where you are watching from in the comments section below. Now, let us go back to the very beginning, long before that Charleston Gala, so you can fully understand exactly how deep and toxic this family betrayal truly ran. Growing up in the Bennett household meant understanding very early on that parental love was a strictly limited resource, and my older brother, Harrison, held an absolute, undisputed monopoly on it. Harrison is 4 years older than me. He is a high-powered corporate lawyer now, exactly the kind of man who wears custom-tailored Italian suits, drives obscenely expensive sports cars he leases to look rich, and speaks entirely too loudly at high-end restaurants just so everyone in the room knows he is the most important person there. To my parents, Montgomery and Sylvia, Harrison was the absolute center of the universe. I was merely a rock orbiting his brilliant sun, an afterthought who only existed to make him look brighter. My father was a mid-level regional manager at a logistics firm who worshipped wealth and status with a religious fervor. He spent his entire adult life trying desperately to rub shoulders with men who made 10 times his salary, joining country clubs he could barely afford the monthly dues for. My mother was a woman who treated social climbing like a competitive Olympic sport. She measured our family's overall success purely by what she could show off to the wealthy neighbors at the monthly HOA meetings, or what elaborate lies she could brag about during our extended Thanksgiving dinners with relatives. Harrison gave them endless, brilliant material for their campaigns of vanity. He was the star high school quarterback, the aggressive debate team captain, the pre-law golden boy who could do absolutely no wrong in their eyes. I, on the other hand, was the introverted kid who genuinely liked raw data, complex patterns, and unbroken silence. Numbers made absolute, perfect sense to me. They did not lie to your face. They did not play cruel favorites. If a massive spreadsheet was balanced, it was balanced. There was no hidden emotion, no psychological manipulation, no gaslighting to endure. My parents absolutely hated that core part of my personality. They could not brag to their friends about a quiet kid who spent his weekend nights learning advanced coding languages and forensic accounting principles in his small bedroom. They desperately wanted a show pony to parade around town, and I was just a reliable workhorse. The blatant disparity in how we were treated was not subtle, and it was certainly not hidden behind closed doors. The turning point, the moment I realized exactly where I stood in the Bennett family hierarchy, happened when I was 18 and Harrison was 22. When Harrison got accepted into a prestigious, top-tier law school, my parents sat me down in the formal living room. My father cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes, and proudly announced that they were taking out a massive second mortgage on our family, home to buy Harrison a brand new, fully loaded Porsche. They enthusiastically justified this absurd financial decision by claiming he needed to look the exact part of a highly successful attorney to land the right summer internships at elite firms. He needed to project a flawless image of generational wealth to attract high-paying clients. 2 incredibly short years later, when I received my acceptance letter into a highly respected university for a rigorous degree in advanced financial analysis, there was absolutely no celebration. There was no celebratory family dinner at a steakhouse. There were no proud phone calls to the grandparents. My father walked into the kitchen, tossed a faded, wrinkled pamphlet for federal student loans onto the counter, and told me I needed to figure out my own college fund immediately. He looked me dead in the eye, without a single ounce of guilt, and stated that they were stretched entirely too thin financially supporting Harrison's lavish lifestyle and law career. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice to argue about fairness. I simply picked up the loan pamphlet and walked silently out of the room. I worked 3 exhausting jobs during my entire 4 years of college. I worked grueling night shifts at a local diner serving drunk college students, and I spent my entire weekends stocking heavy inventory shelves at Walmart just to make rent. I sacrificed sleep, a social life, and my own peace of mind. But I graduated at the absolute top of my class without a single dollar of crippling debt to my name. I paid for my own life. I never asked them for a single dime. But somehow, in their deeply twisted, narcissistic logic, my fierce independence was just another glaring sign that I was stubborn, cold, and entirely ungrateful. They viewed my self-reliance as a personal insult to their parenting. I genuinely thought that putting physical distance between us would finally make things better. I thought if I just put my head down, built a solid career for myself, and stayed completely out of their way, the constant, draining comparisons and the passive-aggressive remarks would finally cease. I was so incredibly wrong. The silence I offered them only gave them a wider canvas to paint their own toxic narrative about me. To them, I was not independent. I was a pathetic failure hiding from the real world, too scared to compete with Harrison's greatness. 3 years ago, I was 26 years old and working at a small, boutique compliance and auditing firm located in the gritty industrial district of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a run-down, deeply depressing office situated right above a noisy dry cleaner. The fluorescent lights constantly flickered. The thin carpet smelled faintly of old coffee and dust, and my direct boss was a man named Victor, who looked like he had not slept a full 8 hours in a decade. We handled the tedious, mind-numbing financial reviews that the massive, shiny downtown firms simply did not want to touch. It was not glamorous work by any stretch of the imagination. There were absolutely no corner offices overlooking the city skyline, no massive year-end salary bonuses, and certainly no luxury corporate retreats to the Bahamas. But I truly, deeply loved the work. I was a forensic financial analyst. My job, quite simply, was to follow the money when it desperately tried to hide in the shadows. Most of the time, I was looking at petty theft, corporate laziness, and entirely predictable human greed. A middle manager siphoning a few $1,000s into a secret personal checking account to pay off gambling debts. A messy, bitterly contested divorce where a wealthy husband tried to illegally hide his vast real estate assets and offshore investment portfolios from his wife to completely avoid paying alimony or child support. Or ugly, vicious disputes among greedy siblings over a contested inheritance after a sudden funeral. It was highly routine. It was quiet, meticulous work, and I excelled at it. But then, on a rainy, miserable Tuesday morning, a massive, heavily bound file landed heavily on my cheap laminate desk. It was the file that changed the trajectory of my entire life. It was supposed to be a routine, completely standard quarterly review for a massive multinational healthcare conglomerate. My department head was a man named Marcus. Marcus was the exact kind of incompetent, smooth-talking manager who cared significantly more about his golf handicap and his boozy networking lunches than he did about actual financial integrity. He dropped the heavy binder on my desk, tapped the leather cover dismissively, and explicitly told me to just rubber stamp it by Friday afternoon. He stated clearly that it was just a tedious procedural check for a minor subsidiary company, and we just needed to quickly bill the hours, collect our modest consulting fee, and move on to the next client. But the moment I opened the first ledger and started scanning the preliminary data sets, the numbers felt incredibly, dangerously wrong. It is very hard to explain to someone who does not look at raw, unfiltered data all day long, but fraudulent numbers have a very specific, unnatural rhythm to them. True, honest financial records are inherently messy. They have odd fractions, irregular billing dates, and wildly unpredictable fluctuations based on human behavior and market trends. But these specific numbers looked entirely too perfect. They were rounded in strange, consistent ways that completely defied basic statistical probability. I started digging deep. I stayed late at the office every single night for 3 consecutive weeks. I skipped meals, surviving entirely on stale vending machine crackers. I drank terrible, acidic office coffee until my hands literally shook over my keyboard. I completely ignored the mocking, condescending text messages from my brother, Harrison, who loved to text me on late Friday nights asking if I was still pushing meaningless paper for pennies while he was out dining with senior law partners at 5-star steakhouses. I traced tiny, seemingly insignificant, totally mundane charges through shell company after shell company. There were highly inflated vendor bills for specialized medical supplies that were absolutely never delivered to any hospital. There were ghost contractors billing for thousands of hours they never actually worked. There were phantom consulting fees paid out monthly to obscure LLCs that did not physically exist anywhere except on paper. Each individual fraudulent charge was deliberately small enough, $300 here, maybe $500 there, to completely bypass the conglomerate's sophisticated automatic security flags. But they were happening tens of thousands of times a month, meticulously spread out across dozens of different administrative departments. When I finally mapped the entire, sprawling network out on a massive corkboard in my tiny apartment, connecting the hundreds of dots with red string and colored pushpins, the final calculated number made my blood run absolutely cold in my veins. It was not a simple rounding error. It was not a minor administrative oversight by a lazy clerk. It was a highly sophisticated, deeply embedded, ruthlessly efficient embezzlement ring. They were bleeding the parent healthcare company of tens of millions of dollars. And the absolute worst part was where the stolen money originated. The funds they were actively stealing were coming directly from vital patient care funds, employee 401k retirement accounts, and critical medical research grants designed to save lives. I took the entire file, securely backed up on a heavily encrypted hard drive, straight to Marcus's corner office. I laid out the undeniable evidence clearly, rationally, and methodically on his desk. I showed him the fake vendors, the hidden routing numbers, and the offshore bank accounts tied to senior executives. Marcus looked at the paperwork, his face completely draining of all color until he looked sick. He did not look proud of my hard work. He looked absolutely terrified for his own job. He leaned across his mahogany desk, lowered his voice to a frantic whisper, and aggressively told me to shred every single piece of paper I had just shown him. He said our firm was far too small, too insignificant to formally accuse a billion-dollar healthcare giant of massive internal fraud. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of a retaliatory corporate lawsuit. He told me that if they sued us for defamation or breach of contract, we would be bankrupt in a month and blacklisted forever. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my chest and explicitly told me that if I pushed the issue, or breathed a single word of this to anyone, he would fire me on the spot, terminate my salary immediately, and completely ruin my professional reputation in the financial industry so I could never work again. But I could not let it go. I could not sleep at night knowing that hardworking nurses and doctors were having their retirement funds secretly drained to buy luxury yachts for corrupt executives. So, I made a definitive choice that Marcus specifically warned me against. I bypassed him entirely. I spent my entire weekend compiling a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier detailing every single stolen cent. I mapped out the entire fraud network with undeniable proof. I sent it completely anonymously directly to the highest level of federal oversight and the parent company's internal ethics board. I did not leave my name. I did not want a massive cash reward. I did not want a promotion. I just desperately wanted the bleeding to stop. A month later, the explosive news broke globally. Someone had triggered a massive, ruthless federal audit of the healthcare company. Federal indictments were rapidly handed down. Marcus immediately knew it was me who leaked the data. He made my life an absolute living hell from that day forward. He constantly overloaded me with impossible, meaningless, entirely administrative deadlines. He openly insulted my intelligence and my work ethic in front of my junior colleagues. He deliberately tried to set me up to fail at every single turn. I was physically exhausted, deeply burned out, and entirely isolated. I realized I could not stay in a toxic workplace that actively punished integrity. I packed my desk into a single cardboard box, handed Victor my formal resignation letter, and walked out of the building. I had absolutely no backup plan. I had no new job lined up. I was entirely on my own. That following weekend, I went to my parents' house for a rare, highly reluctant Sunday family dinner. I was feeling incredibly vulnerable. I just needed a little bit of support. Just a basic level of human empathy from my own parents to tell me that doing the right moral thing, even when it costs you your entire livelihood, is ultimately worth it. I sat at the polished dining room table, pushing my cold food around my expensive porcelain plate, and quietly mentioned to the room that I had left my job because of severe, irreconcilable ethical conflicts with upper management. Harrison laughed loudly. He literally pointed his heavy silver fork at me across the table, his eyes gleaming with superiority. He had just won a massive custody battle for a high-profile client, and he was riding high on his own ego. He said, "Let me guess, Julian. You couldn't handle the intense pressure of basic data entry, so you quit like a coward before they could rightfully fire you. You always were fragile. You never had what it takes to survive in the real corporate world." I looked at my mother. I waited desperately for her to step in. I waited for her to tell Harrison to stop being so cruel. Instead, she sighed loudly, poured herself another heavy glass of expensive red wine, and looked at me with pure, unadulterated disappointment. "Julian, you really need to grow up and face reality. Your brother just landed a massive promotion at his corporate firm, and here you are, unemployed yet again. Why can't you just be normal and hold down a respectable job like a responsible adult?" I gripped my linen napkin under the table until my knuckles turned stark white. I did not argue. I did not try to explain the tens of millions of dollars I had just saved innocent people. I knew they would never believe me, or worse, they wouldn't care because it didn't come with a flashy title. I just stood up smoothly, thanked them politely for the meal, and walked out the front door into the night. I did not speak to them for an entire year. I took a low-profile, independent consulting gig, kept my head down, and built a highly successful financial practice from the ground up. I made excellent money. I bought a beautiful, modern condo. I was genuinely happy in my quiet, peaceful life. Then, the wedding invitation arrived, and every single demon I thought I had buried was dragged forcefully back into the light. The wedding invitation was printed on heavy, cream-colored, imported cardstock with raised gold foil lettering. It felt physically heavy in my hands, a perfect, physical manifestation of absolutely everything my toxic family valued above all else. Appearance, exorbitant cost, and undeniable social status. Harrison was officially getting married to a woman named Clara. Clara was the absolute definition of elite old money. Her family owned a massive, highly lucrative private equity firm and several high-end commercial real estate developments across the entire East Coast. Her father was Reginald Thorne, a man whose personal net worth was easily in the billions. Reginald was a legendary titan in the business world, widely known for his ruthless efficiency, but also his strict, unyielding adherence to corporate loyalty and competence. My mother called me the exact day I received the heavy invitation in the mail. She did not bother to ask how I was doing. She did not ask about my life, my health, or the thriving business I had built. Her exact, rapid-fire words over the phone were, "Harrison's engagement gala is next month at the Thorne Estate down in Charleston. The entire Thorne family will be there, along with half the state's political elite and top CEOs. You are absolutely required to attend, Julian. Go buy a decent suit so you don't look like a homeless vagrant. And for the love of God, do not talk about your depressing accounting jobs to anyone. Just smile, stay completely out of the way, and do not embarrass us in front of these people." I should have thrown the extravagant invitation directly into the trash can. I should have permanently blocked her phone number right then and there. but a small, stupid, entirely irrational part of me still wanted to prove to them that I was not the total, abject failure they stubbornly thought I was. I wanted them to see, just for one night, that I had survived and thrived entirely without them. I reluctantly RSVP'd yes. I had absolutely no idea I was walking straight into a meticulously planned, deeply humiliating ambush. The drive down to Charleston took 4 long hours. I used the entire time in the car to mentally prepare myself for the psychological warfare. I practiced deep breathing exercises. I promised myself repeatedly that I would be flawlessly polite, entirely invisible, and back in my car driving home by midnight at the latest. The engagement gala was held at a sprawling, historic oceanfront estate owned exclusively by the Thorne family. It was the kind of insanely opulent property that had stone gargoyles guarding the towering wrought iron gates and a winding, impeccably manicured driveway longer than my entire street back home. When I pulled up to the brightly lit valet stand, I was instantly surrounded by a sea of overwhelming, aggressive wealth. Clara's family and their elite friends drove pristine Rolls-Royces, custom Lamborghinis, and vintage Ferraris. Harrison's leased Porsche was parked proudly, right near the grand front steps, exactly where everyone arriving could see it. The valet took one dismissive look at my sensible, perfectly clean but entirely average 4-door sedan, handed me a paper ticket without making eye contact, and directed a junior driver to park it in a dirt overflow lot a quarter-mile down the road in the dark. I walked back to the grand estate in the heavy, humid evening air. My suit shirt was already sticking uncomfortably to my back before I even reached the massive, carved oak front doors. The inside of the mansion was breathtakingly, almost aggressively opulent. It smelled like expensive orchids, polished mahogany wood, and vintage champagne. Waiters in crisp white gloves floated effortlessly through the well-dressed, loud crowd, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with caviar and fresh oysters. A professional, highly paid string quartet played softly in the corner of the cavernous grand ballroom. I stood awkwardly near the entrance, adjusting my tie, feeling entirely out of place and deeply exhausted before the night had even officially begun. I decided to immediately find the formal seating chart to locate my assigned table, desperately hoping I was seated with distant cousins or obscure family friends who would simply leave me alone in peace. I walked over to the massive, ornate, gold-framed board displayed prominently near the main dining hall doors. I scanned the family section first. My parents were seated at the VIP head table directly with the billionaire Thornes. Harrison and Clara were right in the center, glowing in the spotlight. Even my father's older brother, a loud uncle I had not seen or spoken to in a full decade, had a beautifully printed, calligraphy-named card near the front of the room. I kept scanning the board. I checked the secondary tables. I checked the tables reserved for Clara's distant relatives from out of state. Nothing. My name was completely absent from the printed list. Finally, I looked away from the elegant board and noticed a small, incredibly wobbly cocktail table tucked in the dark, noisy corner right near the swinging kitchen doors. There was a hastily handwritten, cheap index card taped haphazardly to the edge of the table. It just said Julian, not my full name, not a printed card, just my first name scribbled in blue ink. They had literally placed me as far away from the actual celebration as physically possible, sitting next to the exact doorway where the busy waitstaff cleared dirty plates and loudly scraped leftover food into garbage bins. I stood there for a long time, staring at the pathetic card. I felt a tight, hot knot of pure anger form in my chest. The blatant disrespect was so casual, so deliberately calculated to remind me of my exact, worthless place in their family hierarchy. I needed a moment to breathe. I needed fresh air to clear the ringing in my ears. I walked swiftly away from the crowd. That is exactly when I heard the loud, boastful voices drifting from the shadows. Harrison had stepped out onto the opposite side of the expansive stone terrace to light an expensive, imported cigar. He was not alone out there. He was with Preston. Preston was Harrison's chosen best man, a guy born with a massive trust fund who treated absolutely anyone without a 7-figure salary like literal garbage on his shoe. "I cannot believe your parents actually made him come tonight," Preston said, laughing cruelly as he took a sip of his amber drink. My mother absolutely insisted, Harrison replied, blowing a thick, noxious cloud of smoke into the salty air. She said it would look highly suspicious to Clara's parents if my only brother actively boycotted the engagement party. Honestly, I'm just praying to God nobody asks him what he does for a living. The guy is a total loser. He brings down the entire aesthetic of the family just by standing there. Still unemployed? Preston asked, sounding vastly amused by my supposed misery. Worse? Harrison sneered, his voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered contempt. He's doing freelance bookkeeping or some garbage from his living room. You know Simon, right? The guy who used to work with Julian at that dead-end accounting firm in Charlotte a few years ago. My blood froze instantly in my veins. Simon. Simon was a junior analyst I had personally mentored for a year. I had trained him. I had covered for his massive mistakes so he wouldn't get fired. We used to grab beers after work and talk about our careers. I genuinely thought we were close friends. Yeah, Simon. He's working at my father's firm now, Preston said. Simon texted me last week, Harrison continued, sounding utterly delighted by his own malicious story. He said Julian totally cracked up 3 years ago, hallucinated some massive corporate conspiracy, tried to report his own bosses to the feds, and got practically laughed out of the building. Simon said Julian was literally begging on his hands and knees to keep his pathetic job, but they tossed him out like trash. The kid is completely delusional. He has a massive victim complex. I just hope he keeps his pathetic mouth shut tonight so he doesn't ruin my night with the thorns. I stood completely still in the shadows, paralyzed by the sheer scope of the betrayal. My hands gripped the rough stone railing so hard my knuckles throbbed with intense physical pain. Simon had betrayed me. He had fed my arrogant, narcissistic brother outright, fabricated lies just to score cheap networking points with a hotshot corporate lawyer. And Harrison had swallowed it whole, eagerly using it as fuel to despise me even more, to justify his own deep-seated superiority complex. They did not just think I was unaccomplished or lazy. They thought I was pathetic. They thought I was clinically delusional. They thought I was a joke. A cold, incredibly sharp clarity washed over me in that darkness. For 29 long years, I had bent over backwards trying to somehow earn the respect of a toxic family that actively, sadistically enjoyed watching me fail. I had kept quiet to keep the fragile peace. I had absorbed their endless insults, their passive aggression, and their profound neglect because I mistakenly thought fighting back would make me the bad guy. I had foolishly let them define my entire worth as a human being. Not anymore. I did not storm over there and punch Harrison in his perfectly sculpted jaw. I did not scream at him or demand an apology. I just turned around smoothly, straightened my cheap tie, and walked right back into the brightly lit ballroom. The sadness was completely gone. The hurt was permanently erased. All that was left was a quiet, absolute, unbreakable resolve. I was going to survive this night, and then I was going to cut these toxic people out of my life permanently. I walked with purpose over to the massive mahogany bar, ordered a simple glass of sparkling water with lime from the bartender, and leaned casually against a cold marble pillar, watching the pathetic performance of my family unfold before me. My parents were entirely in their element, swimming in a sea of wealth they did not own. My mother, Sylvia, was practically glowing under the massive crystal chandeliers. She was wearing a heavily sequined gown she definitely could not afford without maxing out yet another high-interest credit card, and she was aggressively cornering an older, highly elegant woman named Beatrice. Beatrice was a very wealthy widow and one of my mother's so-called high-society friends. Exactly the kind of person my mother was desperate to impress to validate her own existence. I was standing just close enough behind the pillar to hear their conversation perfectly clearly over the music. Beatrice smiled politely over the rim of her expensive crystal champagne flute and pointed it discreetly in my direction. "Sylvia, darling, is that your younger son Julian over there by the bar? Goodness, he's grown into a very handsome young man. I haven't seen him in years. What is he doing with himself these days?" My mother's fake smile tightened instantly. It was a microscopic shift in her facial muscles, but I saw it perfectly. Her eyes darted toward me, full of absolute panic and disdain, before snapping quickly back to Beatrice. She let out a dismissive, airy laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, Julian," she said, waving her manicured hand aggressively as if swatting away an annoying fly. "He works with numbers. Very behind the scenes. Honestly, Beatrice, he just does little spreadsheets and things. Very boring, solitary work. Hard to explain to anyone. But Harrison, let me tell you about Harrison's latest massive court victory representing that huge tech firm. Little spreadsheets." She casually summarized my entire existence, my grueling education, and my highly specialized, successful career as an embarrassment to be quickly glossed over and hidden away. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I felt completely detached from my own body, floating above the room, like I was watching a beautifully shot documentary about terrible strangers. Suddenly, a massive ripple of energy moved through the crowded room. The loud, buzzing chatter began to die down rapidly. The string quartet seemed to lower their volume respectfully, and the massive crowd naturally, instinctively parted down the middle. Reginald Thorne had officially arrived at the gala. He was a tall, immensely imposing man with thick silver hair and a sharp, deeply calculating gaze that clearly missed absolutely nothing. He did not wear flashy gold watches or raise his voice to be heard over the crowd. He possessed the kind of quiet, absolute, terrifying power that made everyone else in the room look like desperate children playing dress-up. He walked slowly with his daughter, Clara, on his arm. Harrison practically sprinted across the polished ballroom floor to greet Reginald, hastily adjusting his custom suit jacket and flashing his most practiced, charming, highly aggressive lawyer smile. My parents immediately flanked him on both sides, nodding eagerly at every single syllable Reginald uttered, their eyes wide with unhidden avarice and sheer desperation. I watched the entire pathetic spectacle from my pillar, perfectly content to stay in my dark corner next to the kitchen doors. I was fully ready to slip out the back exit and drive home in 10 minutes. But Harrison, high on the adrenaline, before I could firmly pull my arm away and refuse, he physically dragged me into the center of the brightly lit ballroom, straight into the intensely scrutinized inner circle surrounding Reginald Thorne. Reginald was quietly speaking to his executive assistant, a sharp-looking man named Elias who was holding a digital tablet. When Harrison forcefully pushed me forward into the bright light, Elias casually glanced up from his screen. I saw Elias's eyes widen slightly in immediate recognition. He immediately tapped Reginald's arm and whispered something highly urgent into the billionaire's ear. Reginald stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned slowly and looked directly at us. Harrison put a heavy, incredibly condescending hand on my shoulder, squeezing tightly to assert physical dominance. He flashed his million-dollar smile at his future father-in-law. "Reginald, sir," Harrison said, his voice artificially amplified so the surrounding tables of elite guests could clearly hear every single word. "I don't think you've formally met my younger brother. This is Julian." Harrison let out a sharp, highly condescending laugh that echoed painfully in the quiet space. "He's the quiet one of the family. Not much of a talker, this one." My mother stepped right up beside us, terrified that my mere presence was ruining the luxurious aesthetic of the evening she had planned. She gave a nervous, high-pitched giggle that grated on my nerves. "Yes, well," she added loudly, ensuring everyone heard her clarification. "We don't really brag about him. Julian likes to keep to himself. He does basic data entry." The wealthy people standing nearby chuckled politely at the cruel joke. My own family had just served me up on a silver platter as the designated village idiot, sacrificing my dignity to buy themselves a few seconds of favor with a billionaire. I looked at Harrison. I looked at my mother's desperate, heavily painted face. I felt nothing but absolute ice in my veins. Then, I looked straight into the sharp eyes of Reginald Thorne. Reginald did not laugh. He did not smile politely. His piercing eyes were locked dead on my face, studying my features with an intensity that made the surrounding crowd fall completely, breathlessly silent. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, completely ignoring my brother entirely as if Harrison did not even exist. "What did you say your exact last name was?" Reginald asked, his voice a low, commanding rumble that demanded absolute truth. "Bennett," I said calmly, refusing to break eye contact with him. "Julian Bennett." Reginald's face shifted entirely. It was a look of profound, monumental realization. The silence in the room became absolute. You could literally hear the ice melting in the glasses of the guests. You could hear the distant crash of the ocean waves outside the tall windows. Reginald Thorne stared at me, completely ignoring the desperate, confused, panicked looks of my parents and my golden child brother. "Julian Bennett," Reginald repeated softly, testing the name on his tongue like a rare vintage wine. Then, he took another step closer, invading Harrison's space, and said words that shattered my family's entire reality forever. "I've been looking for you for 14 months. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong." "Julian Bennett," Reginald Thorne repeated softly, his deep voice carrying a massive, undeniable weight that seemed to fundamentally alter the gravity in the room. "I've been looking for you for 14 months. For Reginald, sir, there obviously must be some kind of massive clerical mistake," Harrison interjected aggressively, physically stepping his body between Reginald and me, desperately trying to reclaim the fading spotlight. He waved his manicured hand dismissively in my direction, a gesture of pure disrespect. "Julian is just a low-level freelancer. He does basic data entry and minor tax preparation from his living room. If someone in your vast corporate network is looking for a Julian Bennett, it absolutely has to be a completely different guy. My brother doesn't exactly operate at your level of business. He doesn't understand high finance." My mother, sharply sensing the rapidly shifting power dynamics and absolutely terrified of losing face in front of her wealthy high society peers, immediately chimed in to support her golden child. "Yes, exactly," she stammered loudly, her heavily ringed hands fluttering nervously near her expensive pearls. "Julian has always heavily struggled to hold down a proper, respectable corporate position. He severely lacks the ambition for anything significant. Harrison, however, just handled a massive custody case and a highly complex, multi-million-dollar divorce settlement for a major commercial real estate developer. Harrison is the legal mind of the family. Julian is just, well, he is just Julian." Reginald Thorne did not even blink. He did not look at my mother's panicked face. He did not look at Harrison's sweating brow. He kept his piercing, highly intelligent eyes locked firmly and exclusively on mine. The sheer level of cold disregard he showed for my family's desperate, pathetic attempts to tear me down was breathtaking to witness. "Elias," Reginald said quietly, his voice cutting through my mother's nervous, rambling lies like a perfectly sharpened steel blade. The sharp-looking executive assistant stepped forward instantly, his face completely devoid of emotion. "Yes, Mr. Thorne. Please inform the main event coordinator that I will be taking a brief, strictly private recess in the West Wing study," Reginald commanded smoothly. He finally turned his intense gaze to Harrison, and the look in the billionaire's eyes was so incredibly cold, so entirely devoid of basic human warmth or polite amusement, that Harrison actually took a physical step backward in sheer intimidation. "Harrison." "Julian," Reginald said, gesturing politely and respectfully toward the grand, arched hallway. "If you would be so kind as to join me for a drink?" I did not look at my family. I did not give them the profound satisfaction of a smug smirk or a triumphant, angry glare. I simply gave a single nod to Reginald, calmly adjusted my cheap polyester tie, and followed him away from the crowded, suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the grand ballroom. Elias led us through a complex maze of incredibly quiet, dimly lit residential corridors adorned with original, priceless oil paintings and ancient, heavy tapestries. The loud, oppressive noise of the engagement gala slowly faded away, replaced entirely by the soft, rhythmic sound of our leather shoes striking the thick, imported Persian runners. We finally reached a set of massive, solid oak double doors at the end of the hall. Elias opened them swiftly, ushered us safely inside, and silently closed the heavy doors behind us, remaining outside in the hallway to stand guard and ensure absolute privacy. The private study smelled strongly of rich mahogany wood, old parchment paper, and highly aged, expensive bourbon. It was a massive, intimidating room explicitly designed for making ruthless decisions that moved global markets and violently altered the course of entire industries. Reginald walked slowly over to a heavy crystal decanter sitting on a massive leather-topped executive desk, poured 2 generous glasses of amber liquid, and handed one directly to me. He did not sit down immediately. He stood by the massive, roaring stone fireplace, studying me with that same intense, calculating, highly analytical gaze. 3 years ago, Reginald began, his voice completely dropping the formal, polite public cadence and adopting a tone of deep, sincere, aggressive business strategy. My primary private equity firm was in the final, highly sensitive, legally binding stages of acquiring a massive healthcare conglomerate based out of the East Coast. It was a multi-billion-dollar acquisition involving massive amounts of commercial real estate, corporate infrastructure, and highly lucrative medical patents. We had an absolute army of high-priced corporate lawyers, senior auditors, and veteran financial analysts combing through their financials for 6 grueling months. They all completely missed the rot. I took a slow, measured sip of the bourbon. It burned smoothly down my throat, grounding me in the surreal, high-stakes. Reginald's eyes widened slightly in genuine, unfiltered appreciation. A slow, deeply respectful smile touched the corners of his stern mouth. "Exactly," Reginald said, taking a step closer, treating me like a seasoned war general discussing battlefield tactics. My people missed it entirely because the fraudulent algorithm they were using was an absolute masterpiece of subtle, malicious deception. It was explicitly designed to slowly siphon millions of dollars from employee 401k retirement plans and corporate tax reserves without ever triggering a single automated banking alarm. If my firm had finalized that massive acquisition, we would have immediately inherited a catastrophic federal lawsuit from the government. The SEC would have completely dismantled our entire global portfolio. We would have lost hundreds of millions of dollars in highly publicized legal battles, and thousands of innocent, hardworking people would have lost their entire life savings and their children's college funds. He paused, letting the immense, terrifying gravity of the situation fully settle in the quiet, firelit room. And then, right before the ink dried on the final contracts, Reginald continued, his voice dropping an octave, a highly encrypted, entirely anonymous forensic dossier landed directly on the secure desk of my chief compliance officer. It was, without a doubt, the most brilliant, meticulously documented, flawless piece of financial analysis I have ever seen in my 40 years operating in this brutal industry. It perfectly mapped out the entire embezzlement ring from top to bottom, provided the exact offshore routing numbers. It gave us the immediate legal ammunition to quietly pull out of the acquisition, alert the federal authorities to the massive crime, and completely insulate my companies from the resulting nuclear fallout. I looked down at the amber liquid swirling in my crystal glass. I thought deeply about the miserable, exhausting weeks I spent in that terrible, flickering office in Charlotte. I thought about my cowardly former boss, Marcus, viciously threatening to destroy my entire career, cancel my salary, and ruin my reputation if I dared to expose the ugly truth. I thought about my own older brother mocking me ruthlessly over a Sunday family dinner, calling me a fragile, delusional coward for losing a job I had actually actively sacrificed to save total strangers from financial ruin. I tried desperately to push that report up the proper chain of command at my auditing firm, I admitted quietly, looking back up at the Billionaire. My manager was utterly terrified of a retaliatory corporate lawsuit. He explicitly told me to shred the hard evidence and look the other way. I absolutely refused to compromise my integrity, so I had to send the file completely anonymously to protect myself from immediate, permanent industry blacklisting. Reginald nodded slowly, a look of profound, shared understanding crossing his weathered face. True integrity is a highly expensive, incredibly rare commodity, Julian. Most people in this world simply cannot afford it. My executive team spent the last 14 grueling months using every single technological and financial resource at our disposal to track down the brilliant author of that anonymous report. Your encryption was absolutely flawless, but we eventually traced a microscopic digital footprint back to a small boutique firm in Charlotte. When my daughter Clara casually mentioned over dinner that her fiancé had a younger brother named Julian Bennett who worked in forensic finance in that exact same city, the puzzle pieces finally snapped together violently. Reginald set his heavy crystal glass down on the polished mahogany desk. He looked at me, not as a future relative, not as a wedding guest, but as a deeply respected, highly valued equal. "You literally saved my family's legacy, Julian," Reginald said, his voice thick with genuine, unfiltered emotion. "You protected thousands of ordinary employees from total financial ruin and devastating divorces caused by bankruptcy. And from what I just personally witnessed out there in that ballroom, your toxic family has absolutely zero comprehension of the brilliant, highly principled man standing right in front of them." A tight, incredibly painful knot that had lived in my chest for 29 long years suddenly began to loosen and dissolve. For my entire life, I had been starved for basic, fundamental validation. I had been repeatedly, aggressively told by my own parents that my quiet nature, my deep obsession with raw data, and my strict moral compass were massive, embarrassing character flaws. And here was one of the most successful, powerful men in the country, explicitly telling me that those exact traits were my absolute greatest assets. They don't understand it because they only value what they can immediately show off to their neighbors, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, stating the sad, objective truth. If it doesn't come with a massive, inflated salary, a luxury sports car, or a highly prestigious job title, it simply does not exist to them. I am a ghost to them. Reginald's eyes hardened with a cold, fiercely protective anger. I absolutely despise hollow arrogance disguised as competence. I have spent my entire adult life breaking men exactly like your brother in high-stakes boardrooms. I see exactly who Harrison Bennett is. He is a polished, empty suit with a hollow core. But you, Julian, you are the real deal. Reginald stepped toward the heavy oak doors, his large hand resting firmly on the polished brass handle. He turned back to me, his expression entirely serious and strictly business. "Julian, I am going to formally make you a highly lucrative, entirely unprecedented professional offer to join my senior executive team as an independent chief auditor," Reginald said smoothly. "But before we sit down with the lawyers to discuss your future salary, massive bonuses, and benefits packages, we need to immediately address the present situation happening in my house. I will absolutely not allow a man of your high caliber to be treated like an embarrassing afterthought under my roof. With your explicit permission, I would like to set the record completely straight out there. Publicly." I thought about the incredibly disrespectful, handwritten index card currently sitting on the wobbly table by the kitchen doors. I thought about Simon's vicious, career-ruining lies. I thought about my mother's panicked, embarrassed face when Beatrice asked about my life. I looked Reginald Thorne dead in the eye, felt the power of my own truth, and gave him a single, definitive nod. "Do it." When Reginald and I finally walked out of the private corridor and back into the massive, brightly lit grand ballroom, the physical atmosphere of the entire engagement party had fundamentally shifted. The professional string quartet was still diligently playing a soft, elegant classical piece, but absolutely nobody was actually listening to the music. The low, intense, buzzing murmur of high society gossip completely saturated the large room. Hundreds of wealthy guests were casting discreet, highly curious glances toward the grand hallway, eagerly waiting to see the dramatic fallout of the billionaire's sudden, highly unusual departure with a seemingly random guest. I spotted my family immediately through the dense crowd. They were huddled tightly together near the main marble bar, looking exactly like a group of highly anxious criminal defendants desperately waiting for a jury verdict to be read. Harrison was frantically whispering to his wealthy best man, Preston, aggressively running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the aesthetic he cared so much about. My mother was nervously shredding a thick cocktail napkin into tiny, jagged pieces, her eyes darting everywhere. My father simply stared blankly at the polished floor, sweating profusely right through his rented tuxedo jacket. When Harrison saw Reginald and me emerging from the hallway together, a look of profound, incredibly arrogant relief washed over his face. He instantly, predictably assumed the absolute worst about me. In his deeply twisted, highly narcissistic mind, he was entirely convinced that Reginald had pulled me aside to quietly, brutally reprimand me. Harrison truly believed Reginald was lecturing me that my cheap suit, my boring career, and my severe lack of elite social grace were entirely unacceptable for his daughter's prestigious engagement gala. Harrison actually physically puffed out his chest, completely ready to play the role of the highly apologetic, massively successful older brother who was horribly burdened by a pathetic, embarrassing sibling. Harrison took a highly confident, swaggering step forward as we approached the center of the large room. "Reginald, sir." Harrison began smoothly, projecting his loud courtroom voice so the surrounding elite guests could hear his magnanimity. "I deeply apologize if my brother said anything inappropriate, confusing, or out of line in there. As I mentioned earlier, he severely struggles with high-pressure professional environments. He lacks tact." Reginald Thorne did not even acknowledge Harrison's existence. He completely ignored the young lawyer's outstretched hand, did not break his stride, and walked straight past him with the chilling, absolute indifference of a man stepping over a muddy puddle on the sidewalk. Reginald walked directly to the small raised wooden stage where the string quartet was seated. He calmly tapped the microphone stand. A sharp, high-pitched feedback whined loudly through the massive speakers for a fraction of a second before the entire ballroom fell into a stunning, absolute, terrifying silence. The white-gloved waiters completely stopped moving mid-step. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses ceased entirely. Every single pair of eyes in the massive room was locked onto the billionaire host. I remained standing near the edge of the large crowd, actively keeping my posture perfectly straight, my hands clasped loosely and calmly in front of me. I watched my family's faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reginald's deep, authoritative voice boomed through the high-end sound system, effortlessly commanding the massive space and demanding absolute attention. "I want to sincerely thank all of you for taking the time to join my family tonight to celebrate the upcoming union of my lovely daughter, Clara, and Harrison Bennett. It is a beautiful evening, and we are surrounded by dear friends, esteemed corporate colleagues, and highly respected business partners." My mother practically vibrated with desperate, greedy pride. She placed a highly dramatic hand over her heart, looking around at the wealthy guests with a sickeningly sweet smile, fully preparing to absorb the incoming wave of praise and social validation. "However," Reginald continued, his tone violently shifting from a polite, gracious host to a razor-sharp, utterly ruthless corporate titan, "before we raise another glass of expensive champagne, there is a profound matter of strict honor and deep professional gratitude that I absolutely must address publicly tonight. It heavily concerns a man who has been sitting quietly in the dark shadows of this room, entirely unappreciated." Harrison's confident, practiced smile began to slightly falter. He swallowed hard and glanced nervously at Clara, who was standing near the edge of the stage. But Clara's eyes were fixed entirely on her father, an expression of intense curiosity and dawning awe slowly forming on her face. In the ruthless, highly competitive world of high-level corporate finance and law, we are unfortunately deeply conditioned to constantly reward the absolute loudest voices in the room, Reginald said, pacing slowly and deliberately across the wooden stage. "We blindly celebrate the arrogant men in the flashy, expensive suits who aggressively take credit for other people's labor. We reward the men who loudly brag about their massive promotions, their real estate portfolios, and their luxury cars, and who fundamentally mistake loud arrogance for actual, measurable, reliable competence." Harrison swallowed incredibly hard. The thick, heavy tension in the room was rapidly becoming physically suffocating. The wealthy guests, many of whom were ruthless, self-made CEOs, seasoned board members, and sharp politicians, intuitively sensed the brutal, incoming shift in the wind. They recognized a public corporate execution when they saw one. But the brutal, undeniable truth of the matter, Reginald's voice echoed, cold, absolute, and utterly uncompromising, is that the true saviors of our complex industries are very rarely the loudest men holding the microphone. The true heroes are the ones who operate entirely in total silence. The ones who possess the rare, unbreakable, highly expensive integrity to do the incredibly difficult, highly dangerous work without ever demanding an audience, a round of applause, or a massive salary bonus. Reginald stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still. He looked directly out into the massive crowd, completely bypassing my parents' terrified faces, and locked his piercing eyes squarely and exclusively on me. 3 years ago, my primary holding company was fully prepared to finalize a massive, highly publicized corporate acquisition that would have fundamentally destroyed our entire financial portfolio, Reginald stated clearly, his voice ringing with absolute authority. We were walking completely blind into a deeply entrenched, highly sophisticated corporate fraud ring. We were mere days away from inheriting a catastrophic, multi-million-dollar federal lawsuit that would have entirely obliterated the 401k retirement funds and the children's college funds of thousands of honest, hard-working employees. A shocked, highly audible collective gasp rippled violently through the elite crowd. Everyone standing in that room intimately understood the sheer, terrifying, apocalyptic magnitude of a massive federal corporate lawsuit. It meant prison time. It meant total bankruptcy. We were completely saved from total financial ruin and public disgrace by a single, brilliant, entirely anonymous forensic financial report, Reginald continued, his voice rising in immense power and deep respect. A highly complex report compiled by a junior analyst who deliberately, bravely sacrificed his own job, his own stable salary, and his professional safety in the industry just to expose a massive, systemic crime. My executive team spent the last 14 grueling months desperately searching the country for this incredibly elusive financial genius. We wanted to formally offer him the massive financial compensation and the profound, public respect he so deeply, undeniably deserved. Reginald raised his large hand and pointed a steady, deeply authoritative finger directly through the parted crowd, completely past Harrison's pale, heavily sweating face, and pointed directly at my chest. I finally found him tonight, standing right here in my own home, Reginald declared, his voice booming. His name is Julian Bennett. The absolute silence that instantly followed that specific sentence was so incredibly heavy, so completely and utterly absolute, it physically felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the grand ballroom by a vacuum. Julian, Reginald said softly into the microphone, his voice echoing with undeniable, raw respect. You possess a level of raw intelligence and strict moral integrity that absolutely cannot be taught in any Ivy League law school and cannot be bought with any massive trust fund or inheritance. You literally saved my company. You saved my employees' college funds, their retirements, and their livelihoods. And I am profoundly, deeply honored to finally shake your hand in the light. The entire room completely froze. No one dared to breathe, cough, or shift their weight. I looked directly at my older brother. Harrison's entire meticulously manufactured world was actively violently collapsing around him in real time. His jaw was visibly trembling uncontrollably. The highly arrogant, deeply condescending corporate lawyer who had physically dragged me across the marble floor 10 minutes ago to aggressively use me as a pathetic punchline now looked exactly like a terrified, utterly humiliated, incredibly small child. I slowly shifted my gaze to my mother. The heavy, highly expensive crystal wine glass she had been tightly clutching slipped entirely from her trembling, manicured fingers. It hit the hard marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering instantly into 100 glittering pieces, spilling dark red wine across her incredibly expensive designer shoes like blood. She did not even flinch or notice the mess. Her mouth was hanging wide open in a silent scream of absolute, unadulterated, world-shattering shock. I did not gloat. I did not smile triumphantly. I did not pump my fist in the air. I simply stood there in my cheap, off-the-rack suit, maintaining my quiet, absolute dignity, while the brutal, undeniable truth systematically and entirely destroyed the toxic, fabricated lies my family had built their entire miserable lives upon. The profound, suffocating silence in the massive grand ballroom was eventually, mercifully broken by a slow, highly deliberate, incredibly loud round of applause. It started directly near the wooden stage. Clara, Harrison's own beautiful fiancée, was clapping firmly, looking directly at me with genuine, profound, unhidden respect. Within seconds, the applause spread like a massive, unstoppable wildfire through the entire elite crowd of guests. High-powered CEOs, highly influential state politicians, and incredibly wealthy real estate developers were actively, enthusiastically applauding the exact man my family had literally seated next to the filthy kitchen garbage bins. The immediate, physical aftermath of that applause was absolute, chaotic devastation for the Bennett family. As the formal string quartet nervously started playing a fast-paced tune again to awkwardly cover the intense, lingering tension, the dense crowd naturally began to shift and part for me, treating me with a sudden, overwhelming, highly deferential reverence. People I did not even know were nodding at me respectfully. I slowly walked away from the center of the room, heading directly toward the quiet outdoor terrace. I had achieved exactly what I needed to, and I was fully ready to leave this toxic environment. I didn't make it to the heavy French doors before my path was completely intercepted by my deeply panicked parents. My mother practically lunged in front of my body. Her face flushed a deep, highly unattractive, panicked red. Beatrice, the incredibly wealthy high society widow my mother had been so incredibly desperate to impress earlier in the evening, was standing just a few feet away, holding a fresh drink, watching the entire family train wreck unfold with highly amused, incredibly sharp eyes. My mother was completely operating entirely on blind, irrational panic and a desperate, pathetic need for immediate public damage control. "Julian! Oh my sweet, brilliant Julian!" My mother gasped loudly, deliberately pitching her voice incredibly high so Beatrice and all the surrounding wealthy guests could easily hear her performance. She reached out with both hands, desperately trying to grab my arm and pull me into a loving, maternal embrace that had absolutely never existed in reality. "We are just so incredibly, overwhelmingly proud of you. Your father and I, we were just completely overcome with sheer joy when Mr. Thorne spoke. We have absolutely always known you were a brilliant genius, sweetheart. We always knew your quiet little data projects were so deeply, incredibly important to the corporate world." I completely stopped walking. I looked down at her desperately grasping hands, and then I looked directly into her terrified, deeply calculating eyes. I realized in that exact moment that I felt absolutely no anger toward her anymore. The rage was entirely gone. I only felt a deep, profound, heavy pity for how incredibly hollow, fake, and utterly exhausting her entire existence truly was. I took a slow, highly deliberate step back, firmly refusing her physical touch. "No, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly calm, rock-steady, and projecting loud enough for Beatrice and the lingering, eavesdropping guests to hear every single syllable clearly. "You absolutely do not get to say that tonight." Her fake, highly trembling smile instantly collapsed by a massive fraction. Her eyes darted frantically around the busy room, utterly terrified of the massive public exposure happening in front of her high society peers. "Julian, please, sweetheart, keep your voice down. This is absolutely not the time or the place for a family disagreement. Exactly 10 minutes ago," I continued, my tone completely flat and highly clinical, entirely devoid of the messy emotion she desperately wanted to manipulate, "you stood right next to that marble pillar and explicitly, loudly told Beatrice that my career was an embarrassing, boring waste of time. You completely summarized my entire existence, my grueling education, and my highly specialized career as little spreadsheets. You literally told the billionaire host of this party, a man you were aggressively begging for approval, that you do not brag about me because I am a failure who does basic data entry. We were just joking around, son," my father stammered weakly, stepping forward nervously, sweating profusely through his tight tuxedo shirt. You know exactly how Harrison gets when he's incredibly nervous around wealthy people. We were just trying to quickly break the ice with Mr. Thorne. You completely misunderstood the context of the conversation, Julian. Don't ruin your brother's night over a simple misunderstanding. I slowly turned my cold gaze directly to my father. You aggressively forced me to figure out my own college fund with high-interest loans, while you secretly took out a massive second mortgage to buy Harrison a luxury sports car he didn't earn. You sat at Sunday dinner and quietly allowed Harrison to call me a delusional coward for losing a salary I sacrificed to stop a massive federal crime. You actively, continuously chose to believe the vicious, fabricated lies of a junior analyst over the absolute, undeniable truth of your own son. Julian, shut your mouth and stop it right now. Harrison suddenly hissed violently, aggressively pushing his way through the gathering crowd to confront me face to face. His face was entirely contorted with raw, unfiltered, incredibly ugly rage and deep, burning humiliation. His perfectly styled hair was a complete mess. You deliberately planned this entire thing. You completely orchestrated this massive, pathetic stunt with Reginald just to completely humiliate me at my own engagement gala. You are actively, maliciously trying to destroy my legal reputation and my marriage. I looked at my older brother, the supposed golden child, the incredibly successful corporate lawyer who was currently throwing a massive, highly pathetic, red-faced temper tantrum in the absolute middle of a billionaire's ballroom. I didn't orchestrate a single thing, Harrison, I said softly, the absolute truth cutting infinitely deeper than any screamed insult ever could. I didn't say a single word tonight. I literally just stood here in silence while someone else finally told the absolute truth about who I am. The only reason your fragile reputation is currently being destroyed is because it was built entirely on a foundation of lies, massive arrogance, and the constant, vicious belittling of absolutely everyone around you. Harrison aggressively raised his right hand, his fist clenched tightly, looking like he was genuinely, irrationally about to physically strike me in front of hundreds of highly influential witnesses. But before he could even swing, Preston, his wealthy best man, firmly grabbed his shoulder and violently pulled him back. Preston looked absolutely terrified of the terrible legal optics, aggressively whispering into Harrison's ear that Reginald's highly trained security team was actively watching their every single move. I'm leaving, I said calmly, addressing all three of them for the absolute last time. I turned my back completely on my toxic family and walked with purpose directly over to the small, incredibly wobbly cocktail table hidden in the dark, noisy corner near the swinging kitchen doors. The cheap, handwritten index card with my name carelessly scribbled in blue ink was still taped securely to the edge. I slowly reached out, peeled the sticky tape off the table, and carefully folded the cheap card, slipping it securely into the inside breast pocket of my suit jacket. I didn't take it as a fun, nostalgic souvenir of the party. I took it as hard, undeniable, physical evidence of exactly where my family had maliciously placed me in their lives. I walked straight out the massive front doors of the estate, breathing in the cool, deeply refreshing, salty ocean air. I didn't wait in the massive, chaotic line for the valet to fetch my vehicle. I proudly walked the entire quarter-mile down the dark road to the dirt overflow lot, got into my perfectly average, highly reliable sedan, and drove away from the absolute toxicity of the Bennett family forever. Exactly 6 months later, my entire life looks fundamentally, completely unrecognizable, yet incredibly, deeply peaceful. I absolutely did not return to the miserable, flickering office in Charlotte, and I did not go back to my isolated, lonely freelance consulting business. After the explosive, highly public events of the Charleston Gala, Reginald Thorne followed through entirely on his highly lucrative promise. I officially accepted a massive corporate position as the Senior Director of Forensic Auditing for his primary global holding company. My starting base salary was aggressively deep into the 7 figures, and that did not even include the massive corporate performance bonuses, the generous stock options, and a comprehensive benefits package. I completely relocated my entire life to a new city. I bought a beautiful, incredibly modern piece of real estate overlooking the water, paying for the massive house entirely in cash. And the very first executive professional decision I made in my new, highly powerful corporate role was to aggressively recruit Victor, my old, permanently exhausted boss from the terrible Charlotte firm, to be my lead senior analyst. For the absolute first time in a decade, Victor actually looks fully rested, highly respected by his peers, and adequately, generously compensated for his massive intelligence. As for the Bennett family, I have learned that the universe has a highly efficient, deeply satisfying, and utterly ruthless way of balancing the scales when the absolute truth is finally exposed to the harsh light of day. My parents have desperately tried to contact me incessantly for the last 6 months. My personal phone is entirely flooded with pathetic, rambling voicemails, lengthy, highly emotional text messages, and desperate emails. My mother completely, shamelessly changed her entire public narrative literally overnight. Now, she aggressively brags to her HOA friends and to Beatrice about her brilliant, highly successful executive son Julian, who works directly with billionaires on massive corporate acquisitions. They constantly invite me to elaborate Thanksgiving dinners, desperately begging me to come home so they can proudly show off my new corporate title to their jealous neighbors. I absolutely never answer their calls. I never reply to the texts. I established an absolute, completely impenetrable boundary of silence. I realized with absolute clarity that they do not actually love me now any more than they did 6 months ago. They simply love my new, undeniable proximity to immense wealth and massive corporate power. They are completely, hopelessly starved for the high-level status I now effortlessly possess, and I absolutely refuse to feed their endless, toxic vanity. Harrison's meticulously manufactured, highly arrogant life, however, experienced a much more spectacular, highly public, and utterly devastating collapse. In a twist of absolute, perfect poetic irony, a massive federal investigation was quietly launched into the complex, highly lucrative real estate holdings of Preston's incredibly wealthy family. The very same arrogant best man who had viciously mocked my career on the terrace that night. The intense federal investigation revealed a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering operation heavily tied to illegal offshore shell companies and fraudulent inheritances. The absolute worst part for Harrison? His prestigious corporate law firm had deeply represented Preston's family in those exact fraudulent real estate acquisitions. While Harrison was not directly indicted for criminal fraud and managed to narrowly avoid federal prison, his professional legal reputation was utterly, completely destroyed by the highly toxic, highly publicized association. The senior partners at his elite firm deeply panicked, desperately trying to avoid a catastrophic PR nightmare and a massive lawsuit, and quietly, forcefully forced Harrison to completely resign. They stripped him entirely of his massive salary, his annual bonuses, and completely removed him from his highly coveted, fast-tracked partnership track. He is practically unemployable in the high-end corporate sector now. Furthermore, Clara, Reginald's highly intelligent, deeply perceptive daughter, completely called off the extravagant, multi-million-dollar wedding. After personally witnessing Harrison's cruel, pathetic, highly insecure behavior at the gala, and learning the absolute truth about how he actively conspired with a liar named Simon to spread vicious rumors about his own brother, Clara was entirely, utterly disgusted. She realized with absolute horror that she was about to legally bind herself in marriage to a deeply insecure, highly narcissistic man who fundamentally lacked basic human empathy and basic integrity. The massive wedding was permanently canceled. The highly expensive, gold foil invitations were formally rescinded, and Harrison was left completely alone with absolutely nothing but his rapidly mounting debt and his massive monthly lease payments on a luxury Porsche he could no longer afford to drive. A few short weeks ago, I had to drive back down the coast for a highly sensitive, high-level corporate board meeting. On the long drive home, I deliberately took a slight, quiet detour. I drove slowly past the massive, towering wrought iron gates of the Thorne estate in Charleston. I pulled my car over to the side of the quiet road, rolled down the window, and looked through the heavy trees at the grand, sweeping architecture and the massive crystal chandeliers glowing warmly through the tall glass windows. I sat there in the quiet, peaceful comfort of my car, listening to the distant, rhythmic crash of the ocean waves against the rocks, and I thought deeply about absolutely everything my toxic family had called me for 29 agonizing years. They constantly called me the quiet one. They always said it with heavy, dripping disdain, as if my silence was a clear sign of intense, pathetic weakness, a severe lack of ambition, or a hollow, meaningless emptiness. But they were fundamentally, entirely, completely wrong. My silence was absolutely never weakness. My silence was strict, intense observation. It was the careful, meticulous gathering of undeniable facts and hard data. It was the quiet, absolute, terrifying precision waiting patiently for its exact, perfect moment to strike with maximum impact. They mistakenly thought that just because I did not aggressively scream for their attention or loudly brag about my salary, I had absolutely no value as a human being. But I learned the hard way that the most powerful, highly indestructible, massively important work in this world is often done completely without an audience. If you are listening to this story right now, and your own family has ever made you feel like an irrelevant, meaningless footnote in their grand, dramatic story, if they have ever completely belittled your honest, grueling work, totally ignored your massive sacrifices, or actively tried to violently shrink your presence just to make themselves look slightly bigger, do not ever let them define your worth. Do not scream at them. Do not beg on your knees for their toxic, conditional validation. Just keep quietly, diligently building your undeniable, incredibly successful reality. Because eventually, the absolute truth always demands a massive, brightly lit stage, and the absolute, unbreakable silence of your massive success will be the loudest, most incredibly devastating sound they will ever hear. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to silently, painstakingly prove your worth to people who actively, maliciously refuse to see it? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.